Welcome to Should I Read It? Should I Read It is a weekly podcast that takes a deep dive into books. I'll provide a summary of the book and tell you how the ideas in the book relate across all the books we've covered so far. Welcome to episode 26 of Should I Read It? Today we're going to look at how to win friends and influence people. Who doesn't want to be friends? Who doesn't want to have some influence over others? Who doesn't read that influence sentence and at least wonder in the back of their heads how slimy the content coming might be? How to Win Friends and Influence People is a classic book by Dale Carnegie, all about how to treat people well. The influence you can have with people is not because Carnegie is going to tell us how to manipulate them. The influence comes from being a decent human being. Carnegie wrote this book to help you be just a bit better at dealing with the situation that life throws at you. Here's a quote from him. If by the time you've finished reading the first 3 chapters of this book, if you aren't then a little better equipped to meet life's situations, then I shall consider this book to be a total failure so far as you are concerned. Now, before he digs into the main content of the book, he gives us 9 suggestions we should be using if we want to get the most out of the book. Here they are. 1. Be someone that desires to learn. 2. Read as an overview for each chapter and then read again deeply. 3. Ask yourself how to apply each item. 4. Highlight and make notes. 5. Review the book every month to keep it in mind. 6. Apply the rules all the time or you're going to forget them. 7. Get accountability. 8. Review your week in light of the teaching and see how you did. 9. Record your triumphs as a result of the teaching in the book. These 9 suggestions are not only great for the content of this book, they're good for any book you're going to read at any point in your life. So do them. Now, before we dig in, I want to make a few caveats on the content of the book. This is an old one. It was first published in 1936, and as such, there are a number of assumptions about genders and roles that seem crazily dated today. Much of this is only encountered in the final section as Carnegie talks about marriage, and the root behaviors he's suggesting are good ones. The examples he chooses, though, are pretty dated. He actually spends a whole chapter going about how much women like clothes. He spends a decent amount of time talking about how women nag. He spends an entire chapter talking about how a man will only talk to a woman if she has few opinions and is really mainly interested in what the man has to say. These all seem ridiculous to me. I hope I'm never like this. The second item worth mentioning is that there is a bunch of repeat in the principles of the book. Carnegie keeps coming at the same behavior from a different angle and in a different relationship context. A good example comes fairly early. In part 1, chapter 4, Carnegie tells us to be a good listener instead of a good talker. The very next chapter tells us to talk about the interests of the people we are talking with. Chapter 6 is about giving compliments to those you speak with, which is one way to make them feel important. But it's a repeat of chapter 2, which is all about smiling because it will make others feel important as you have a happy demeanor, and is the antithesis of chapter 1, which was about criticizing. They're really all circling the same ideas with a slightly different looks at how you do the behavior in real life. As I work through the book, I'm going to look at the behaviors as a whole and combine a bunch into one behavior that may manifest itself in a few different ways and in a few different chapters in the original book. The final thing that I should mention is if you want to dig into the book, is that Carnegie is going to tell you a ton of stories. Way too many stories, especially in the first couple sections of the book. You could cut half the stories and still have a really story-heavy book. He uses the stories to try and show us the principles in action. And they do, but half the stories are still going to get the same point across totally fine. With that out of the way, let's look at the behaviors that Dale Carnegie says we should adopt if we want to be just a bit better with our relationships. The first overarching context I'm going to look at is making people feel that they matter. One of the main themes is making people feel that they matter. One of the big thrusts is his advice on this, that we work to make people think that they matter instead of just waiting for our turn to talk about ourselves. Here's a quote from the book. You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. This comes down to asking more questions and talking less. For years, I had a sticky note on my desk that said exactly that, and it helped my discussions with my customers immensely as we dug deeper into their problems instead of just saying how awesome I was. We came up with better solutions. Letting people know that they genuinely matter to you starts with your first interactions with them. It starts with the smile you use and you give them as you greet them. Here's another quote from Carnegie. Actions speak louder than words, and a smile says, I like you. You make me happy. I'm glad to see you. That's why dogs make such a hit. They are so glad to see us that they almost jump out of their skins. So naturally, we're glad to see them. Can you think of a better way to let someone know that they matter to you than by being genuinely happy to see them? Next, remember their names. Here's a quote from Carnegie again. Jim Farley discovered early in life that the average person is more interested in his or her own name than all the other names on earth put together. Remember that name and call it easily, and you have paid a subtle and very effective compliment. But forget it or misspell it, and you have placed yourself at a sharp disadvantage. We also saw the same idea in H3 Leadership with Brad Lomenick when he said, whether you're dealing with clients or meeting with colleagues, always remember and address them by their names. In a moment when people are often viewed as job titles or potential sales, this will make a massive difference in your work. I need to be honest here. I gave myself an out for a long time on remembering names. I just told myself I was bad at it. But what it came down to is that I didn't care enough to put the effort in. Remembering someone's name and using it shows them that they matter to you. So put the effort into names and stop letting yourself be lazy. Because that's what's really happening. Just being lazy about it. Another key to making people feel like they matter is noticing the things they do well. We'll come back to that later as we look at what Carnegie has to say on helping people change. One warning that Carnegie gives us is that we need to be real with our praise. Not just flattery in the way that shallow people need to prop up their egos, but true appreciation of the good work that someone does. Here's a quote from Carnegie again. The difference between appreciation and flattery? That is simple. One is sincere and the other is insincere. One comes from the heart, out. The other from the teeth, out. One is unselfish, the other is selfish. One is universally admired, the other is universally condemned. Next up, let's look at disagreements. Let's start with a quote from Carnegie. Criticism is futile because it puts a person on the defensive and usually makes him strive to justify himself. Criticism is dangerous because it wounds a person's precious pride, hurts his sense of importance, and arouses resentment. As you read How to Win Friends and Influence People, you'll note that criticism is one of the key things that Carnegie speaks against. He'll call it nagging later in the section on marriage, but he keeps tackling it from different angles throughout the book. We're often quick to criticize so many around us. I think of my middle child who is willful and adventurous. It is a constant battle for my wife and I to remember not to come down hard on her for adventures, and to remember to praise her for the smallest behaviors that show she's doing better and she's showing better control. It's hard to remember to keep the criticism out of not just our words, but our actions because the little behaviors we use can speak volumes of disapproval without any words attached. Here's a quote from the book. You can tell people they are wrong by a look or an intonation or a gesture just as eloquently as you can in words. And if you tell them they are wrong, do you make them want to agree with you? Never. The subtle eye roll we use and try to deny speaks loudly. We saw Patrick Lencioni talk about this when we looked at the 5 dysfunctions of a team as well. And here's how Lencioni put it. Teams that lack trust are incapable of engaging in unfiltered and passionate debate of ideas. Instead, they resort to veiled discussions and guarded comments. That's going to lead to just plain old arguments instead of constructive, fierce brainstorming with your teams. Instead of moving forward together, you argue and leave holding the same ideas and thoughts that you started with because nobody listened. Here's another quote from Carnegie. 9 out of 10 times an argument ends with each of the contestants more firmly convinced than ever that they are absolutely right. Now, when it comes to arguing with those around you, Carnegie says that we can't really ever win this argument. Oh, sure, we may have won some intellectual superiority over someone else, but they almost never are happy about it. They're annoyed, and though they may concede the point, they're not on our side. They're most often just waiting for us to mess up, and then they're going to pounce. We all mess up. Sometimes, maybe lots of the time, we are the ones that is wrong. And by driving hard to win an argument, we may have just created an enemy where there wasn't one before. To combat this, Carnegie recommends a few things. First, admit it when you're wrong. Here's how he puts it. You will never get into trouble by admitting that you may be wrong. That will stop all argument and inspire your opponent to be just as fair and open-minded and broad-minded as you are, and it will make him want to admit that he too may be wrong. Years ago, I cut someone off in traffic. They were mad. They were honking, and they could see them screaming and waving their hand at the window at me. They even followed me into the parking lot I was going to pull into, but this is where the story takes a turn. Now, I knew I was in the wrong, and I said so. I said something along the lines of, I'm really sorry that I wasn't paying attention. I absolutely cut you off. Too busy talking to my friend. Thank you for paying enough attention and making sure that we all didn't get to an accident. Thank you. Now, my admission of guilt diffused the situation entirely. All the other driver said was to be more careful and have a good day. You could see his rage leak out of him as I talked and as I took the blame, and as I thanked him for keeping us safe. Could we do something like this more often? Could we talk about how we're at fault in a situation instead of focusing on how we've been wronged? Finally, Carnegie asks us to understand people instead of just condemning behavior. Here's another quote from Carnegie. Instead of condemning people, let's try to understand them. Let's try to figure out why they do what they do. That's a lot more profitable and intriguing than criticism, and it breeds sympathy, tolerance, and kindness. To know all is to forgive all. I've heard a story, no idea if it's true, but it's about a man in the subway. His kids were up and running all over the car, making a lot of noise, interrupting all the passengers. They were fighting and yelling and just being a pain in the butt. Finally, the man sitting beside the father said something about the kids. You need to get them under control, something like that. Now, like a sleeping person waking from a haze, the father looks around and realizes what the kids are doing, and he apologizes. He says, hey, I'm sorry, I know my kids are being bad. I didn't realize. Now, what he also says is he's been so busy thinking about his wife that just died and realizing that he's now a single father. They're on that train home from the hospital after saying goodbye to their wife and mother. Does your perspective change when you hear that story? Are you more likely to say, hey, do you need me to get groceries? Do you need something tonight? How can I help you? Than judging them for having wild kids. Once you understand the expectations and circumstances of those around you, their behavior often seems entirely reasonable and expected. Now, let's dig into sales. All of us are in the business of sales. We're trying to sell our kids on the benefits of behaving the way we wish they would. We walk into an office every day and sell the value that we bring to our job. Now, unfortunately, sales got a bad name. We think of the used car salesman, like the one that told me years ago, a real man wouldn't need to go home to talk to his wife about a truck purchase. Yeah, I feel slimy even saying it. And the cheap suit. I feel like I'm wearing it almost. No one wants to be like that. But if we're not selling our services and the value we provide, no one's selling it for us. People have problems, and they're looking to solve them. We need to tell people how we can help them solve the problems that they have. Here's a quote from Carnegie. So the only way on earth to influence other people is to talk about what they want and show them how to get it. When you show someone how to solve their problem, they want to make a purchase. They want to trust you to solve their problem. You've made them want to make this purchase. Here's another quote from the book. There's only one way under high heaven to get anybody to do anything. Did you ever stop to think about that? Yeah, just one way. And that is by making the other person want to do it. That does mean you need to go back to a number of things that Carnegie talked about at the beginning of this book. You need to listen more than you talk. Find the real problems that your customers have instead of just assuming that they must need whatever it is you want to sell. You need to ask them lots of questions about their needs and then maybe use those questions to steer them towards the purchase you think is in their best interest. This means that you need to sell your ideas with story and drama. Here's how Carnegie puts it. In this day of dramatization, merely stating a truth isn't enough. The truth has to be made vivid, interesting, and dramatic. You have to use showmanship. The movies do it, television does it, and you will have to do it if you want attention. In Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, they tell a story of a purchasing agent roaming an entire organization for all the gloves that were purchased across everything. He ends up with a huge stack filling an entire boardroom table, and then he brings the various purchasing managers to look at all the gloves. Not only are they surprised to find that they have a huge pile of gloves, they're surprised to see the prices attached to the glove and find out that some departments are paying much more than others for the exact same glove. This is the type of showmanship that Carnegie is talking about. It speaks to more than just our intellect. It speaks to our emotions, and with our emotions behind us, we're much more likely to make the sale that we were hoping for, or to make the change that we're hoping for. Now, let's look at bringing change to your team. As I just said, we are all in sales. We're trying to sell ideas to our teams and to our bosses. To do this, Carnegie gives us a number of tips. First, bring your team on board with the decision-making process. If someone has taken part in the decision, they own it. They're way more likely to follow through. Here's how he puts it. People are more likely to accept an order if they have had part in the decision that caused the order to be issued. This has been talked about in a number of books I've covered, so listen back through them. Specifically in the 5 dysfunctions of a team, they talk about letting your team argue. Here's how they put it. Contrary to the notion that teams waste time and energy arguing, those that avoid conflict actually doom themselves to revisiting issues again and again and again without resolution. In Great at Work by Morton Hansen, they also talk about fighting, about things so that you can fight and then unite on the decision later because everyone feels like their voice was heard. In Multipliers, we learned that good managers don't try to hold all the decisions to themselves. They work to let their team take part so that there's buy-in across the organization. If you want your team to come alongside you when change needs to get made, make sure you include them early in the process. Then as you go forward with change, make sure you recognize them for the behaviors you want. You need to give them recognition. Here's how Carnegie puts it in the book. Remember, we all crave appreciation and recognition, and we'll do almost anything to get it. But nobody wants insincerity. Nobody wants flattery. While Carnegie doesn't use this example, I think of my youngest child, who is currently potty training. We praise her for every attempt at using the toilet. She farts on the toilet and we clap, and it's a big party. The slightest behavior that is toward the end goal gets this party. While we shouldn't be treating our employees like children, we're not clapping at them for farting. We should be sincerely recognizing the hard-fought strides they make as they improve in their work. It is so easy to leave those we work with in a vast desert of compliments and encouragement. It's easy to jump on the failures and mistakes and never tell someone when they do a good job. Who can you tell today that they did a good job on something? Who can you tell tomorrow? How can you make it a daily practice to notice something that someone on your team did that is worth praise? Also, stop for a second. What did your spouse do today? Did they do the dishes? Did they do anything that's worthy of praise? They probably did. Recognize it. With that, we're jumping into marriage, which for most of us is the most important relationship that we have around. It's our spouses and our partners. If the life you live at home is in shambles, then it's going to affect your success. One of the key assumptions in one of the books we looked at earlier, called Personal Kanban, is that we have a false sense of separation between home and work. Here's how they say it in Personal Kanban. Professional life, personal life, social life. They are often treated as separate entities, but our lives and insights cannot be segregated. Work-life balance is a false dichotomy. Compartmentalization is not sustainable. It forces life's professional, personal, and social elements to vie for attention, bringing with them seemingly competing expectations and goals. While Carnegie doesn't call it this false separation specifically, he does apply the principles he's been writing about to our home relationships. Just like the beginning of the book. He starts with criticism in our relationships at home, and he calls it nagging, and he does attribute it to the wife, but this is both sides of the relationship, people. But here's how Carnegie puts it. Neither royalty nor beauty can keep love alive in the midst of the poisonous fumes of nagging. Again, this is where we got the first real solid glimpse of the dated stereotypes in the book. We talked about it at the beginning, so I'm not going to dig into it now. The point that Carnegie is making is really that all the negatives of criticism we've been reading about in the book apply just as much to marriage. Another key to a strong marriage in Carnegie's view is not trying to remake your spouse into the image you want. Worry less about how they can be a better spouse to you and more about how you can be the spouse they need. Here's one of the quotes in the book. Or as Leland Foster Wood in his book, Growing Together in the Family, has observed, success in marriage is much more than a matter of finding the right person. It's also a matter of being the right person. This seems to fly in the face of much of what we see written now, as people are almost always told to go for their own self-actualization first and foremost, and if it continues to work in the relationship, bring that partner along with you. How many relationships would survive if we spent time worrying about understanding our spouse and their needs? What would marriage look like if we helped their spouses be the best person they can be every day? What would it look like if we spent more time thinking about how we can do marriage better instead of how we are being wronged in our relationships? To do this, we need to know what our spouse really wants. Remember, Carnegie's already talked about listening, showing genuine interest, and being active with our interests in others. We need to extend that towards our spouses and partners as well. Carnegie spends a chapter talking about doing the little things for our spouses, like bringing them flowers or coffee. I think of this as a discussion about learning your spouse's love language. And this is out of the 5 love languages. If you're not familiar with that book, get it, read it. Here's how Carnegie puts it. From time immemorial, flowers have been considered the language of love. They don't cost much, especially in season, and often they're for sale on the street corners. Yet, considering the rarity with which the average husband takes home a bunch of daffodils, you might suppose them to be as expensive as orchids, as hard to come by as the edelweiss which flowers on the cloud-swept cliffs of the Alps. Why wait until your wife goes to the hospital to give her a few flowers? Why not bring her a few roses tomorrow night? You like to experiment, try it. See what happens. In an episode of the One Thing podcast, and you'll find a link to that in the show notes as well, they talk about what's called the hug routine, which is how you greet your spouse when they come home from work, and how you greet each other when somebody comes home from work, or when someone enters the house. This routine is another one of the little things that you can do to show your spouse that they are the most important thing to you. Adopting this routine means that you don't start talking about how the kids are crazy or anything like that. The first thing you do is embrace your spouse long enough that you relax into each other's arms. You take this few minutes to connect and tell each other that you love each other. Then after you've connected, you get on with the day. The point is that we need to be as intentional about the behaviors we use with our spouses as we are with the ones we use at work. Success in only one area still means we failed. Now, one area that Carnegie kind of surprised me in this book was his admonition that marriage is also a lot about sex, that we need to educate ourselves about it. Now, I haven't done the research on the sexual beliefs of the 1930s, but it was kind of my impression and understanding that talking this openly about sex would be a fairly risky thing to do. Well, Carnegie tells readers to take sex and marriage seriously and educate yourself about it. He says, specifically, read a good book on sexual side of marriage. You could benefit from this today. How many people only know about sex from the encounters they've had? which they expect to be modeled off some highly inaccurate performances they've probably seen on adult sites. How many people talk about their sexual lives as a way to try and impress others when the reality is, maybe 10% of that, maybe not even that much. So read a good book on sex. Maybe even make the goal of your sexual life the pleasure of your partner. In my experience, this is way better for both parties when you're trying to maximize the pleasure of the other. Carnegie ends his look at having a great marriage with a key insight we all need to have as we think about our marriages. It's not the grand gestures that make a good marriage, it's the little things that happen day in and day out that add up to a marriage that lasts. Here's how he puts it. That's what marriage is in the long run, a series of trivial incidents. And woe to the couple who overlook that fact. Remember this if you want to have a strong marriage. You got to put the effort in. The little things matter. You need to do them every day around your house because that's what builds the strong foundation of a marriage. This episode of Should I Read It is brought to you by the 8-Week Business Bootcamp. If you're tired of struggling with your business, tired of not getting the traction you want, tired of working overtime with little to show for it, then Bootcamp is for you. Join me to get your business back on track and still have time to see your family. Find a link for Bootcamp in the show notes. As always, our final question is, should I read How to Win Friends and Influence People? While How to Win Friends and Influence People says a few things that seem comically dated to us, the underlying advice, absolutely solid. If you're to read this book and start working on the behaviors that Carnegie asks of you, then you're going to have better relationships. As you read the book, feel free to skim the stories. He tells a lot of them, and at times it feels more like a way to try and hit some arbitrary word count instead of adding much more depth to the principle he's trying to get across. But yeah, you should purchase and read How to Win Friends and Influence People. Thanks for listening to Should I Read It? To support the show, you can leave me a review in iTunes or a heart or a star in whatever podcast player you use. These help more people find the show. If you want to get more reading done, you should get an Audible membership. If you use curtismchale.ca/recommends/audible, that will help the production of the show financially. In our next episode, episode 27, we're going to look at why eating a big ugly frog every morning can help you get more work done.